writers, you're listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we bring you insights and inspiration for growing your self-publishing business, coming to you from Kobo's headquarters in Toronto.
Hey podcast listeners, I'm Chrissy.
I'm Stephanie, and in today's episode we're talking to author Sacha Black, who I want to include this because she says she has 5 obsessions: words, expensive shoes, conspiracy theories, self-improvement, and breaking the rules, which I think is true.
It's a pretty good list. I'd say I'm in on about 3 of 5, but you can guess which 2 I'm not.
Shoes?
Yes.
No. You're not in those shoes?
Not expensive shoes.
I mean, I like a lot of shoes.
Yeah.
Does that mean they're expensive? I don't know.
Hard to say. Is it like quantity that adds up to a lot of expense?
That might
one
be
expensive quality. All right, we digress. Sasha is also about to embark on a super exciting next phase, which is, as we were speaking to her in this episode, it was her last week at her full-time job. She was about to become a full-time author, but she still does some developmental editing and also does a lot of nonfiction writing about writing, and specifically how to craft compelling villains, which we've never really touched on this podcast. But of course, villains are part of every single story, so I think there's something to learn here for everyone. You're going to love it. Keep listening. Thank you.
Welcome to the podcast. And for our listeners who might not be familiar with you, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So my name is Sacha Black, and I am a British indie author. I live just outside of London. I write young adult fantasy books. I have a series out now that's a couple of books in. I'm writing the 3rd one. And I also write non-fiction writing craft books, teaching other authors how to develop their writing craft. And I'm also a developmental editor, a blogger, a mum, a wife.
Quite busy.
Lots of things. Yeah.
That's a lot. I didn't realize that you were an editor as well. I knew the other hats just based on some other podcasts that I've heard you featured on. How would you say you manage to divide your time up? Do you divide up each day, or is it just kind of the projects come as they do?
That is a very good question. If I'm totally honest with you, I'm one of these terrible people that just works all of the time. So up until the end of this month, I'm still employed, but it's all got a bit much. So I've decided to throw my hat in the ring and go and be a full-time indie author, kind of entrepreneur in this industry. So up until recently, I would kind of go to work, be at work at 8, finish at 4, come and be mum until 7 p.m, which is bedtime. And then I started working again, and I usually worked until midnight. So yeah, I just burnt the candle at all of the ends and in the middle.
You can't see our faces, but they are big eyes.
I'm shocked. I feel like I'm shocked every episode about people like, oh yeah, I work all the time. I'm like, I don't know how you do it.
Yeah, but full time, congratulations. That is a huge step. That's so exciting to just step off that high dive and go for it.
Thank you so much. I'm literally on my 1-week countdown, and I have been extremely excited, and I've kind of had a bit of a meltdown today, and just in fear, what am I doing? So apart from today, I've been extremely excited, but today I am just terrified.
No, well, step 1 is strong work ethic, and you have it in spades.
Exactly.
So I think you're going to be fine.
Oh, thank you.
So just to maybe this will add on to your stress, but what initially drew you to self-publishing?
A really good question. So I worked for kind of a corporate organization, and I went through a sort of a rocky period at work where I was under threat of redundancy 4 times in 2 years. And then a couple of times before that. Luckily, I was never made redundant. But the reason that was kind of the biggest driver is because my house was owned by my employer. So if I had have lost my job, I'd have also lost my house. And I didn't really want to ever be beholden to one organization or one stream of income ever again, to be kind of put in that situation. So I think it was a multitude of things, both wanting multiple streams of income, and the easiest way to do that is by being an indie author, and also that kind of not really wanting a boss. And I have been told once or twice that I might have an authority problem. But yeah, no. So I like working for myself. I derive my motivation by working for myself, and I just think, I want to keep my royalties.
Mm-hmm.
So multiple reasons.
Yeah. So did you make a go at submitting your work to quote unquote traditional publishers, or did you go straight indie?
straight into indie. I listen to a lot of podcasts, so all of them basically in the industry, and got lots and lots of advice from there. And I fell in love with the industry before I'd even published. So no, I haven't ever submitted. I'm not saying no, though. I might in the future. I think it's good to have different streams of income, and a traditional model is one way of doing that. I think it opens up other marketing avenues. So I'm not saying no. Also, I'm a slight control freak, so I do like to decide my own covers and things. Oh, all my dirty secrets are coming out today.
Love it.
That's what we're here for. But that's great to hear. I think I'm hearing that answer more and more, honestly, and it's an interesting shift where like the original indie wave was authors who had these big backlists that they were getting back from publishers, so that was their history. And then you got a kind of group of independent authors who were unsuccessful submitting, and they have that stack of rejection letters. And now, finally, there's this great group of authors who, the data is there for itself, and they're just going straight into it. I don't have the data to back up these claims, but just from personal experience, I've been in the indie world for, 6 years now. That's what I've been seeing. And so it's awesome to hear that you just went for self-publishing right away.
Absolutely. And I think, I'm still quite fresh in this industry. I've not even been published for 2 years. I think my 2-year publishing anniversary is at the end of May. So I kind of came into this industry when it was already a teenager, maybe. I don't know how you want to describe it, but I kind of started really going down the writing with intent to publish as the kind of Kindle boom was coming around. So, sort of 10 years ago, I started, writing, getting notebooks out from my childhood. And then a few years later, I started blogging. And then a couple of years into that, I kind of, realized that actually, I've been doing this for a really long time, and I probably ought to, take it somewhere else and publish.
Awesome.
So just to switch gears a bit, so you mentioned blogging, but is that what kind of pushed you to write about books about craft, such as villains or like protagonists?
Yeah, when I first started blogging, it was just a place to rant about things that annoyed me, which was mostly at that time my day job. I didn't really start blogging with the intent to write a novel or to publish, but I kind of fell into the community and met lots of people, most of whom at that time were writers. I started writing flash fiction, dug up my old stories. I was one of these people who's kind of always written, but I'd never really taken it seriously. And the more I wrote, the more I ranted, the more I wrote flash fiction, the more I realized that actually, reflecting on, how I used to journal, how I was such a bibliophile as a child, I should have probably always done this. And the flash fiction turned into short stories, which turned into a NaNoWriMo challenge. And that just led from one thing to another. But the blogging particularly changed from my early days of ranting into somewhere that I could store my writing lessons. So I read consciously. I like to learn a lot from each book. I sort of one of these people with 1,000 post-its in each book that I read. And I'm senile, so I needed somewhere to write them down. So I just put them on my blog, and that kind of mushroomed, and I got a lot more traction with traffic, sharing those lessons. And a few posts went viral, particularly around the villains, and I kind of saw a market there, an opportunity. And that sort of led me to writing the nonfiction.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing that you just kind of plugged into with an expertise homing in on one specific topic. So like villains is, you think of genres, right? When you're thinking of a thriller, but there's a villain in every story. Can you kind of speak to that and how you address a stereotypical villain across genres?
I can. I think... Well, see, this is the thing. I really hate cliched villains, but they're so easy to do. The reason there's a villain in every story is because stories at their core are about change, whether it be the world changing in a dystopian novel or your protagonist changing through their character arc and them overcoming a flaw in order to, defeat the obstacle, and the obstacle being the villain. But the villain is actually the source of this change, because you don't get the change in the protagonist unless you have some level of conflict forcing the protagonist to have to, develop and get over this flaw in order to defeat that obstacle. So yeah, your villain is your source of conflict. And I think the reason that they so often become stereotyped is because there are so many archetypes for villains, whether it be, your female, clichéd, sexy female villain.
When you're thinking about teaching craft and villains specifically, I would think of a villain as very stereotypically in a thriller or a fantasy novel, but there's a villain in every story. And how do you kind of address teaching how to write a compelling villain across different genres?
I think there are different aspects of villains. So, for example, something that is cross-genre is theme. So your hero obviously represents your book's theme, and your villain should, in some way or another, represent your book's anti-theme. So it's less blatant than just being, theme and anti-theme. It's more nuanced because lots of your characters ought to represent different facets of that. And I'll give an example of that in a second. For example, if your hero represents sacrifice, and the most obvious example there is Katniss from the Hunger Games, your villain should represent some kind of opposing force. So President Snow, for those who haven't watched the Hunger Games, is the villain. He represents sacrificing others for his benefit. So Katniss will, go into danger in order to get medicine to save her friend. She will climb trees to rescue small children. She will, she went and volunteered to be a tribute in this terrible fighting game to save her sister. Whereas President Snow will kill the other young children tributes. He will, there's also these kind of wolf type animals who are reincarnated versions of previous tributes. So he's, again, sacrificing others for his benefit, kind of twice over. So your villain should represent, at your book's core, some kind of opposing theme or moral. Another thing that I like to talk about is giving your villain a wound, something from their past that influences their behavior in the current book. So this is exactly the same for a hero, but quite often writers forget to kind of focus on the villain as much as they do on the hero. But your hero always has some wound from their past that creates their flaw, which stops them from winning. Your villain ought to have something from their past as well that does the exact same thing, but it's driving their negative behavior rather than driving the hero to do better. And I sometimes get questioned on this, and writers say, I don't want to put all of this background and history in. Well, you don't have to. I'm not saying you need to give, reams of information dumps. But the reason that you need to know as the author is that people, even villains, do things for a reason. Most people who are sane will not commit atrocities unless they truly, truly believe that they're doing the right thing. And villains do. They believe they are doing the right thing. So there are, these kind of personality parts of a villain that transcend genre, I think, anyway.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I really love that. It's very thought-provoking, because also the best villains are ones that you empathize with a little bit, and you feel that profound conflict as a reader, and you get into these raging debates with your friends about like, oh, but I kind of liked him. I hate myself for liking him.
Absolutely. And I think when you get those kind of shades of grey, the heroes that I like have the same shades of grey. So just like you give your hero some kind of negativity, you ought to give your villain some kind of positivity, whether that be a value, or, some kind of integrity. If you give them something, it makes them more human. It kind of gives them that aspect of humanity, and that's what readers connect to.
For sure. Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm also thinking about what happens when the author becomes the villain. For example, when George R.R. Martin killed Ned Stark, and I will never
I know. And seriously, Game of Thrones, is everybody freaking out? Everyone's going to die.
Yeah, I literally don't know how it's going to go.
I know.
That's what I think about it. And I'm like, I don't know what's going to happen.
But I think like if we're talking heroes and villains, we can't have not mentioned Game of Thrones.
That's true.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, and just the way that he flips it too, you know, the villains become the heroes, and that's really the epitome of what you're talking about here. It's like a sliding scale of personalities.
Absolutely. And there are some really good examples of villains with redemption arcs at the moment. So I don't know if you've seen Once Upon a Time, which is a TV show, but Regina, the evil queen, has an epic redemption arc. And, you know, you look at, I don't know what, you know, spoilers, but, you know, Game of Thrones, Jaime Lannister also has a kind of redemption arc. You know, and speaking of Ned Stark, I also think he's a great example of the inner conflict, and George R.R. Martin does that a lot. But Ned's death is a set. Oh God, am I allowed to talk about spoilers? Is that?
I feel like it's happened 8 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay. Fine. So Ned Stark kind of has this inner turmoil, and this is a really good thing for writers to do, is to layer the conflict. So, you know, you have macro conflict, which is sort of this, you know, worlds or the Lannisters against other Targaryens or whatever, and then you have micro conflicts, which might be, you know, Tyrion and Jaime fighting each other kind of as brothers or whatever, and then you have inner conflict, and Ned is such a good example of this. But George R.R. Martin does this all of the time. He pits their values against each other. So Ned is very wise, and kind of in that season he's asked by the king at the time to go and help him, and he kind of knows he's reluctant because he knows, you know, it's probably going to lead to his death, and yet his loyalty is his other strongest value, and he feels compelled to go, and that creates this really juicy emotional turmoil that readers love. I loved it. And he does that a lot. So
love it. I'm glad we went there. I think we had to.
yeah.
On the flip side of the coin of talking about villains, and you have touched on this a little bit, but what about when you're trying to craft a really kick-ass protagonist?
So there are so many things. I think the most difficult thing about creating a hero is creating a unique hero. You know, there are as many heroes as there are books, and how do you actually get yours to stand out from everybody else's? And I think that comes down in part to voice. But the way that I like to talk about it and teach it is by talking about your hero as if she is a pair of rose-tinted spectacles that your reader wears. So nothing in your story happens unless it comes into contact with your hero. So how do you then turn that on its head and convey the nuanced differences between one hero and another? So there are kind of 4 aspects. The first are your hero's actions. The second are your hero's thoughts, their dialogue, and their feelings. But it's not just as simple as, you know, doing dialogue or, you know, saying what they feel. I think it comes down to more than, you know, these big parts like traits. I think it goes right the way down to the sentence level details. So, for example, I used to have a teacher when I was at school who used to say, "Got that?" at the end of every single sentence. And I remember kind of tallying them in class, you know, and giggling in the back as my friends are trying to race each other to count to a certain number or whatever. You know, so does your hero have some kind of tick in their dialogue? Does your protagonist, always describe characters that they interact with using juxtapositions or similes? So Melissa Albert, who wrote The Hazelwood, which is kind of a fairy tale young adult novel, is just a master of this. Her main character, Alice, I think it's an Alice in Wonderland retelling, must be, always uses these absolutely stunning juxtapositions every time she comes into contact with a new character, you know, and that's different. Not every single hero will do that. So, you know, it's looking at, you know, each word and how that embodies what your character is feeling at that point. So that's probably my favorite thing to talk about when it comes to heroes.
Is there any characteristics that you continually see that you wish would just stop happening?
Loads. So I think the biggest one really is the bravery trap. I think there's a bit of a myth around heroes being brave. Of course they are brave and they do need to be brave, but I don't think that's really what readers care about. I think they actually care about sacrifice, and that comes from whatever the action or task that your hero needs to do in order to overcome their flaw, which is usually sacrificing a part of themselves. They have to let go of a wound or a psychological barrier or whatever. They have to be willing to die in order to win. And I think it's that, the greater the sacrifice, the more that the thing they are sacrificing means to them, the better and the more connected your readers are to your story. So it's not just about, leaping off cliffs or, going into Mordor. I think writers need to forget about your heroes being brave and look more at what they're willing to give up in order to win.
I like that.
I like it a lot.
So we'll just move to a marketing question.
Oh, yeah.
A little out of there. But I was lurking on your website, as you would do, and you had an article on how to market your books. So I was reading some of your top tips, and it was like, do your research, do experimenting, be up to date on current trends. But you also noted to take an interest in copywriting, which I thought was interesting. Mm-hmm. And not many people talk about this, but can you just elaborate further on why you think copywriting is like a skill many authors should take an interest in?
Yeah, because I don't mean to kind of make sweeping generalizations. Actually, that's a lie. I'm literally going to make a sweeping generalization now. But our attention spans are waning somewhat right now. Mm-hmm. We are in this world of instant same-day prime delivery. I want to binge watch a series so I can go to Netflix and literally watch the entire thing. So, I think that's kind of seeped into everything, including shopping attention spans. So first impressions, even, this is my psychology background coming in now, they are made within 12 seconds. You do not have long anymore to grab people's attention. And the best way to grab somebody's attention is by writing concisely and kind of in a gripping way. And copywriting is the fastest way to learn to do that. I don't profess to be a good copywriter, but I am trying very hard to study copywriting. So yeah, and it's so important as indies as well, because you have to copyright your blurbs and your taglines. You have to copyright your Facebook ads. You have to copyright your Amazon ads. And if you don't, you're just going to hemorrhage money through poor ads that don't get high clicks, that don't convert to sales. So yeah, it's essential.
Yeah, and then without that skill, do you see the same benefit to paying someone? For example, there are, companies that will write your blurb for you for a fee.
It's really difficult because I think you have to be wary. There are people who will take your money and not do a good job. So, but there are, wonderful organizations like the Alliance of Independent Authors who have watchdogs for things like that. I think as long as you do your research and check the integrity of the companies, then why not? For me personally, I think there's a benefit to learning, because in the long run, you can save yourself money. And if you're going to treat this as a business, which I am doing, then why would you not learn the skill? You can convert that to your mailing list emails even, and create better subject lines, which increase your open rates, which will likely increase your. So yeah, of course, if you're cash rich and time poor, then why not spend the money? But I prefer to develop the skill myself.
Mm-hmm. Great advice. You have a lot of writing tips on your website, and we can't unfortunately dive into all of them now. So I was just wondering if you could give yourself a shout out and talk about where listeners can find you online.
My website is www.sachablack.co.uk, and that is Sacha with a C, not two S's. So SACHA is how you spell my name, Sacha. And I sort of have a blog stream on there with tons and tons and tons of tips. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What's your favorite tip? That's my favorite question.
Oh my goodness me. Oh, that's so hard. Never quit, because you only lose when you quit. You cannot predict where 2 years ago I would have laughed in everybody's faces if they told me I would be handing my notice in to write full time. But I just, day after day, I kept grinding out the words. I kept learning. I kept studying. Actually, that's probably my second tip. Never stop studying. But yeah, as long as you don't quit, as long as you keep creating doorways, as Dean Wesley Smith calls them, and also B.E. Schwab, I think, talks about these doorways into your writing world, your books. Write short stories, write flash fiction, publish, box sets and books, and just never quit. Never, ever quit, and keep learning.
Awesome.
Yeah, I got goosebumps. So other than you diving into this full time, what can readers expect from you next?
Right now, I have a gigantic piece of paper pinned to my brand new office door with literally about 200 strips of Post-its on there of all of the things I want to do. So right now, it's mostly trying not to get overwhelmed by my huge list. But if I was to narrow it down, I am going to finish the third book in my fantasy series. And also I'm prepping my next nonfiction book, which is kind of talking about some of the things that I alluded to earlier, which is kind of the anatomy of prose, that good, how do you create good quality prose? How do you, create your voice by, looking at different sentence level nitty gritty things, but it's not about grammar. Let me just clear that up straight away. Not about grammar. And then I'll also be doing this summer, I will be launching some sort of mini writing craft courses, really kind of, an hour or 2 hours looking at those. So yeah, those are my next 2 books and the next kind of big project that I'm going to look at.
Super exciting.
And then what have you been loving lately? It can be anything, book, movie, TV show.
Other than
Game of Thrones. So I kind of have been learning a lot from poetry at the moment. I never thought I would be interested in poetry, but, because at school they kind of massacre these things for me. Well, they did anyway. But expressionist poetry, which is the sort of Rupi Kaur type poetry, kind of very, very short micro poetry. But Atticus is somebody who I've fallen in love with recently. And the book I read most recently, I think, was called Love Her Wild. And fiction, I am currently reading The City of Brass by S.A. and I will try and say this name. I think it's Chakraborty. I hope I've said that correctly. But it's just stunning. The magical world building is just fantastic. And it's one of those books that's also written, beautifully. So I'm obsessed with beautiful sentences at the moment.
I feel like the poetry is a nice parallel to your focus on copywriting in a way, poetry is about the importance of every word.
Absolutely. But the funny thing is with this expressionist poetry, it's kind of copywritten poetry. I don't know how else to describe it because they condense, a message into a sentence, and it's such an epiphany. Each one of these things are such emotional kind of soccer punches that I can't think of them as any other way than copywritten poetry. It's just fantastic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of it in that way until you're just framing it, but absolutely right. And then it's interesting how those poets have branched into social media in a way that poetry never really has before, and blending these areas of social media and getting engagement on poetry. Like I never would have seen that coming.
I know, exactly. And I'm sure I was at the London Book Fair a few weeks ago, and I'm sure I heard somebody say that Ingram Spark, their best-selling books were poetry at the moment. Ingram Spark's best-selling books. I was just like, that's fantastic, because you don't expect that to be. No. But I think that's the power of social media. These people have like 1 million followers. 1 million. I've got 1 million followers. It's amazing.
Could be you. Who knows? 2 years from now.
Oh, well.
Amazing. So that's it for our list of questions. Is there anything else that advice to listeners or to your future self?
Oh my goodness! Stop panicking. No. Advice to my future self. Wow. I think it's just to feel the doubt and do it anyway. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm trying to tell myself right now. And so let me tell that to anybody that's listening. I know what that doubt feels like, guys. We all feel it. And the only way you win is by, doing it anyway. So yeah, just keep writing.
Couldn't have ended on a better note. Perfect.
It's very positive.
Well, we wish you all the best. I don't think you need luck. You've got the knowledge and the hard work that you need to make it work. So we will obviously be following your big next step upwards and onwards. And thank you for taking the time during this very important week to join us.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
So we hope you enjoyed our episode with Sacha. Make sure to check out her website because she has a lot of great writing tips that I think everyone should check out. We'll also have links on our Kate Bell blog to her website for you to check it out.
Yeah, it's been nice to be back in the office. I'm just back from a long vacation, and we both survived a horrendous round of food poisoning.
Yeah, a lot of people were affected, including both of us out of a 300-person building.
Many survived. Everyone survived, and we're proud to say we've emerged on the other side. Fellow sufferers, we're all ears. Tell us your plight. We hope none of you are currently under the weather, but if so, I guess podcast listening is a good way to go.
I thought I knew what food poisoning was, but I was 100% wrong. That may be too much, but I'm going to be honest with you.
Also, I chose to watch The Favorite, that movie, while I was sick and totally dead on the couch. Nobody warned me that movie is grotesque. There are so many gross scenes. There's a lot of barfing in that movie.
I was thinking of dance routines that I see. A lot's going on. You had quite the day.
I had an emotional day, some highs, some lows. I mean, still an incredible movie. I loved it, but just probably not the best time to watch.
And we also, once we emerged from the plague, we had a Gatorade's twin pick.
Yeah, we have a wonderful Slack channel here called Casual Office Twins, where we have a lot in common at Kobo. We love books, we love authors, we love tech, digital startup stuff, but we also are often dressing extremely alike. It's not uncommon for some, 2, 3, 4 people to all be wearing the exact same outfit. So we'll post our twin pick on this episode blog post. How about that? So you can see a good twin post versus
what we did.
Plague survivor twin pick, where our only commonality was vitamin water.
Mine was blue Gatorade. Blue Gatorade for me. But yes, we're happy to be back
together
thriving.
At last. Thriving. I'm drinking coffee again. It feels good.
Chrissy pulled muscles, but she's doing well. I have a cold, which I think probably attributed from this, but here we are.
Ever grateful to have you kind listeners, and hopefully you'll stay with us after this very unrelated segue into our personal lives.
We thought you would like to know.
This really deep behind the scenes.
Very.
But as always, we appreciate you listening and would love to hear your ideas, stories, food poisoning related, villain related. I think it kind of links back to a villain. There was a lot of suspicion about villains.
What was the cause?
Yeah. Who was out to get us? So,
exactly. Tell us your favorite villains. I always love to know.
Yeah. Maybe this will inspire you to write a little side story in your novel. I don't think there's a meet cute in there, though. As always, thank you for listening, and we will see you next time on the Kobo Writing Life podcast.
Bye, guys.
Thank you for listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we provide insights and stories from leaders and experimenters in the world of self-publishing.
If you want even more information about growing your Kobo sales, check out our blog or find us on social.
And if you're just finding us and ready to start your self-publishing journey today, sign up for free at kobo.com/writinglife. Until next time, happy writing!